Good evening, everybody. My name is Sean Hamill. I'm one of the academic directors of the Birkbeck Sport Business Centre at Birkbeck College, University of London. I'd like to welcome you all to the British Council Sport Week in Seoul. I was very fortunate to take part in the event myself in Seoul in 2014. I'm sorry I can't be with you this evening due to prior commitments, but my colleague Dr. Dominic Chai will be able to deal with all related queries to the presentation. I would like to start by just very briefly recapping a few details about Birkbeck. Birkbeck is a college of University of London, established in 1823, so we will be having our 200th anniversary in 2023 in 6 years' time. It's a research-led university located in central London. Historically, our provision was for working people studying for degrees in the evening, but we now have a very large full-time undergraduate and postgraduate schools. We're ranked in the top 1% of all universities in the world. The purpose of my presentation this evening is to, first of all, give you an overview of the postgraduate sport management portfolio of programs at Birkbeck. And what I'm going to do is, using a case study of the English Premier League, provide you with an illustration of the kind of issues that we address in the programs. Now, the Birkbeck Sport Business Centre is one of the longer established academic sports research groups in the UK. We were established in 1999. The catalyst for establishing the centre was an attempted takeover of Manchester United Football Club by the B-Sky B Broadcasting Company. And the context was that Sky had an exclusive deal to broadcast the Premier League. And this was challenged by the regulatory authorities in Britain, who said it was potentially monopolistic. And as a defensive strategic move, Sky proposed to buy Manchester United, because in the event that collective selling of broadcasting rights to one broadcaster was illegal, that they would then own the club that was most often broadcast, and therefore they would protect their competitive position. We organised a conference on the subject and got involved with a coalition of groups arguing that the bid should be proposed to the Monopolies and Merging Commission, which it was, and the bid was subsequently rejected. One of the key items to arise from this conference was that actually there was very, very little understanding of the way that sport business operated in the UK, which was quite surprising given the prominence of professional sport in the cultural life of the country. I think the reason for that was that until the Premier League arrived in 1992, and more specifically the Sky entry into the pay-per-view broadcasting market for sports, actually sport was not really a serious economic activity. So it had a high level of prominence in terms of cultural and social terms, but economically it really wasn't that significant. And therefore it was neglected by academics in the economic and business fields. It was well investigated by sociologists, etc., particularly focusing on the problem of hooliganism, but in economic and business terms it was neglected. So we were one of the first academic centres in the UK to start to investigate the economic and business structure of professional sports leagues, focusing initially on the Premier League and football, but over the subsequent 20 years we've begun to look at a range of other sports as well. We offer 8 main programmes: sport management, the business of football, MSc Sport Management and Marketing, MSc Sport Marketing, MSc Sport Management Governance and Policy, MSc Management with Sport Management, and 2 postgraduate certificates. Basically, what we try to do in the programs is provide an offer which at one end of the spectrum caters to those applicants who really want to focus on the football industry. But at the other end, providing offers which allows you to look at football, but a range of other sports sectors. We're also involved in two major international programs, UEFA MIP, which is aimed at former international players, and the Masters in European Sports Governance, which is an executive program for senior officials in sports governing bodies, mainly in Europe. So why study at Birkbeck? Well, as I've already said, it's a research-led university. So by definition, we're not just teaching out of the textbook. All the members of staff are all active researchers. It's a University of London degree, so it has got a high level of international recognition. All the modules, with the exception of research methods, are all sport related. So what we are not offering, which many institutions offer, is a generic management program with some sport added on. Sport is at the core of everything we do. Even the research methods module prepares you for your dissertation, which will be on an aspect of sport business. The classes are all delivered from 6 to 9 in the evening. They're a mixture of lectures by the academics, external speakers, case study presentations by students. In terms of the student body, it's roughly 1/3 UK nationals, part-time and full-time, many of whom are working in sport organisations, 1/3 mainland European Union, and 1/3 North America, the Middle East, Korea, Japan, China. So there's a strong international dimension to the programme. However, you will be studying with British students. So we pride ourselves in being an international institution. We're in one of the most culturally diverse cities in the world, but you will have a UK experience at Birkbeck, and you will have a London experience in one of the most dynamic cities in the world. I'd now like to take you through a case study of the English Premier League by way of illustration of how we approach the teaching of the curriculum on the various programs. This is an applied management program. Obviously, theory is critically important. We're a research-led university, and we interrogate the various problems thrown up by sport business in the classic social science mechanism by using theory to inform our students' understanding of the problems that sport businesses face. But it is applied, and the case study method is a key feature of the way we organise our teaching. So let's go through the example of the English Premier League by way of example and illustration of how we organise the curriculum. Let's start with a little bit of theory. There's a very famous academic paper by an American academic called Walter Neal from 1964. The paper is entitled The Peculiar Economics of Professional Sports Leagues. And the key point of this paper is the word peculiar, because what Neal lays out are the key characteristics of sport competitions that make them different from mainstream economic activity. He makes the point that sport is one of the rare industrial activities where you actually have to cooperate with the people that you're competing against in order to produce the product. So even in an individual sport like boxing, someone has to organise a competition in a way that the two fighters are reasonably evenly matched, for example. And Neal makes the point that actually a critical factor in the success of any competition is that there is a degree of competitive balance. So if it's obvious that one competitor is going to win the competition, there's no real incentive for anybody to watch the competition, or to, more importantly, to pay to watch that competition. The theoretical assumptions laid out by Neal in his paper and by other academics in the field lay out the critical organisational principles of all the major American leagues. So, in order to achieve competitive balance, all the American leagues, such as the NFL and the NBA, collectively sell the broadcasting rights, and in some of the leagues also collectively sell commercial income, and then aggressively redistribute the income among the teams to ensure that no one team has an excessive labour purchasing advantage over the others. This ensures that there's a high level of uncertainty in the competitions, which makes them more attractive to fans who want to go to the stadia, but also to broadcasters who will want to pay to broadcast the spectacle. The use of salary caps also prevents lower revenue teams spending more than they earn in an attempt to achieve sporting success against higher revenue teams, because there is a well-documented tendency in sport for teams to chase sporting success over profitability, which almost universally results in a high level of bankruptcy among participating teams. In fact, if you go back into the history of North American sports, it is why they have a closed league with no promotion and relegation, because relegation almost always meant financial catastrophe. This then leads us to the Premier League case. Unlike in North America, football in Europe was organised with the sporting imperative as the primary objective. This meant that there was promotion and relegation. Teams rose and fell in the sporting pyramid between divisions, depending on how successful they were on the field of play. However, because the revenues generated by football were not high, the gap between the highest revenue teams and the lowest revenue teams in the top two divisions in English football, for example, were not excessive. So this meant, for example, that Nottingham Forest in the late 1970s were able to be promoted from the Division 2 to Division 1 to win the Division 1 in the next season and go on to win the European Cup in the following season. However, one of the characteristics of the English leagues, and indeed football across Europe, was because, as the theory predicts will happen, sports teams prioritise sporting success over profitability. There was a marked tendency by professional football clubs in England to spend all available revenue on talent. This meant that there was a chronic lack of investment in football stadia. The net result of this was, by the 1980s, English football stadiums were dangerous places. There was a major fire at a stadium in Bradford in 1985, which left 65 people dead. And then the final culmination of this lack of investment was the Hillsborough disaster in 1989, when 96 Liverpool fans were killed in a crush at an FA Cup semi-final. The subsequent investigation found that there was an extraordinary level of incompetence on behalf of the stadium management and the police. There followed a major government investigation led by Lord Chief Justice Taylor. The net result of this investigation was that government regulation compelled the English teams to make their stadia all-seater and to begin the modernisation process. This coincided in 1992 with the foundation of the Premier League. And what the Premier League foundation essentially was a breakaway by initially the top 22, but subsequently reduced to 20 clubs, to form an independently managed competition, still with promotion and relegation to the lower divisions, but critically they retained all the broadcasting and commercial revenue generated by the league. It also coincided with the introduction of pay-per-view TV in Britain. Sky Broadcasting at the time was in competition with a company called BSB. Rupert Murdoch, who controlled Sky, knew from his experience in Australia that people would pay a pay-per-view subscription for high-quality sport. Football was the dominant sport in England. Sky, therefore, paid an extraordinarily high sum of money by the standards of the time to purchase the exclusive broadcasting rights for the Premier League from 92 to 97 in an ultimately highly successful strategy to secure domination of the pay-per-view market in Britain. BSB collapsed and was merged into Sky to form B-Sky B. This marked the critical turning point in the commercial development of sport in the UK and indeed in Europe, because for the first time professional sport in Britain became a proper business. It was made a proper business not by the people in football but by the broadcasters. The Premier League today is made up of 20 teams. Each year 3 teams are relegated, 3 games are promoted from the Football League Championship below. In order to avoid the problem of relegated teams becoming financially bankrupt because of the dramatic decrease in revenue that follows from relegation, they are paid a parachute payment for 3 years, which cushions the blow of relegation. The revenue for the Premier League is divided under 3 headings: match day, which is stadium related income, broadcasting and commercial. I'm going to take you through each of these 3 headings to illustrate the complexity of the Premier League's organisation, but also the high level of innovation that it's applied, which has led it to become the most successful national soccer league in the world and the most successful professional sports league outside of North America. But in fact, the revenues of the Premier League now are challenging the revenues of the major 4 sports competitions in North America. Matchday related income in 2014-2015, the last season for which we have consistent data, was 18%, so less than 20%. So a lay person looking at these figures might say, well, people actually going into the stadium, it's not really that important anymore. This would be a significant mistake. When Rafa Benitez was the manager of Liverpool and Sir Alex Ferguson was the manager of Manchester United, they had roughly the same broadcasting revenues. They also had roughly the same commercial revenues. At that time, the vast bulk of commercial revenue related to shirt sponsorship. Standard Chartered Bank, which is a major bank in the Far East, was a shirt sponsor of Liverpool, because Liverpool is a major brand in the Far East, and Liverpool were regularly broadcast. However, Manchester United had 75,000 seats at their Old Trafford Stadium. Liverpool had 46,000 seats. Rafa Benitez was not 30,000 paying customers better than Sir Alex Ferguson. The point is that all the revenue sources are important where the margins for success are very narrow. That's the first point. So the fact that the matchday revenue has gone from being the most important source of revenue to the 3rd most important source of revenue does not diminish the fact that it remains critically important. Another critical aspect of the matchday part of the business model of a Premier League club is that broadcasters do not want to broadcast empty stadia. Because the Premier League clubs started to modernise early in the 90s because they were forced to because of the recommendations of the Taylor Report, most of the stadia, in fact all the stadia in the Premier League, are now very modern facilities. What the clubs found was that when they built modern stadia, more people came, more women came, more older people came, more higher income people came. They were able to sell corporate boxes. So the rebuilding of stadia actually started a virtuous circle by which, if you modernise your stadia, it generated higher revenue, which meant you could modernise your stadia. Because the stadium became more attractive and the crowds were very healthy, the broadcasters liked the fact that the grounds were full. In fact, in the last 2 seasons, there's been a very, very interesting innovation whereby the Premier League has persuaded its member clubs to cap the ticket prices for away fans attending games. Why would they do this? It's counterintuitive. Surely the logical economic proposition is to charge the maximum price that the market will bear to raise higher revenue. However, the broadcasters realised and the Premier League realised that part of the package that the Premier League is selling is not just the athletic contest on the field of play, which is obviously very important, not just the loyalty of the home fans for their team, but it's actually the emotional contest between the home fans and the away fans. If the away fans are priced out of the ground, then you lose that element of the atmosphere. I make this point to illustrate that one of the issues that we look at in the sport marketing module, for example, is that there is a high degree of complexity in the sport product. It is not just about the athletic contest on the field of play. It is not just about the physical conditions in the grounds, which we look at in the sport event management module. It is also to do with the cultural investment of fans in their respective teams. Again, another peculiar aspect of the sports business proposition is that sports fans who attend grounds tend not to substitute for another sports team when their team is performing badly. This is called sport equity. And this emotional investment is a very valuable part of the commodity mix of a successful sports product, which is particularly highly valued by broadcasters. The Premier League is very much aware of that, which is why they encourage their clubs to cap the away prices. The biggest source of revenue of Premier League teams is broadcasting income. In 14-15, it was 53% of total revenue. When the Premier League was formed, the overwhelming proportion of the broadcasting revenue came from domestic broadcasting rights because that's where the market was. English people wanted to watch their team live on TV. However, the Premier League has always been very, very aggressive in trying to develop its international footprint. So, for example, over 10 years ago, it first raised the possibility of playing an extra game abroad. There are currently 38 games per club each season. The proposal was raised that they would play an additional game outside of England, in North America, in Japan, China, Korea. This plan has been blocked by FIFA, that currently has the power to regulate international competition. But the very fact that the plan was mooted tells us something about the international ambitions of the Premier League. Later in the presentation, I'll discuss just how the Premier League has gone about selling itself internationally. But for now, I want to make one other important observation about the broadcasting revenue. The Premier League has by far the highest broadcasting revenue of any sports competition in the world outside of the major American leagues, and in fact is now almost on a par with them. But absolutely critically, that revenue is distributed quite equally among the 20 clubs. International income is distributed equally among the 20 clubs. For the domestic income, 50% is distributed equally, 25% is in relation to where clubs finish in the league, and 25% in relation to how often they are broadcast. The critical point is that the top team in England rarely receives more than 2.5 times the revenue from broadcasting rights than the bottom team. If you compare that with La Liga, the ratio is 12-1. This is how a team like Leicester can win the Premier League, because the Premier League, above all else, while the Leicester case may be a one-off aberration, what they are really seeking is what is described in theory as match day uncertainty. It is not necessary for Sunderland at the start of every season to have a chance of winning the Premier League. All that is necessary is that at any given day they can beat Manchester United. This is critically important from the point of view of the broadcasters. And it takes us back to the point that I made about Walter Neal and at the heart of the core principles of sport economics. The Premier League recognises that a high level of uncertainty of outcome, defined in this case as match day uncertainty, is a key source of competitive value in the sports broadcasting marketplace. Broadcasters want uncertainty of outcome. We can see this in its most graphic illustration in the way that live broadcasting rights are much more valuable than live highlights, because once the result is known, or once the result is easily predictable, the value of the rights declines. The way that the Premier League organises the distribution of its broadcasting rights revenue follows exactly from their belief in that central principle, and they believe gives them a high level of competitive advantage in the global market for the broadcasting rights for national team competitions. The third revenue stream is commercial income. In 14-15 it was 29%. Historically, as I alluded to earlier in the case of Liverpool, the vast bulk of this revenue came from items such as shirt sponsorship, which actually tracked broadcasting exposure. So you could actually argue that commercial income was a subset of broadcasting income. This is because most clubs, in fact, were not very sophisticated in commercial terms. And so they essentially drove revenue from having a shirt sponsor who wanted to be regularly exposed on television. And so the value of the rights was to some extent a function of how well the Premier League sold the broadcasting rights abroad and domestically. However, over the last 10 years we have seen the development of a higher level of commercial sophistication among individual clubs, most notably by Manchester United. And independent commercial revenue is now becoming much more important. Again, we address this phenomenon in the sports marketing module in particular. So, what are some of the key success factors of the Premier League? So, if you are a salesman for Premier League broadcasting rights in Korea, how might you sell the Premier League? Well, first of all, you might produce your copy of the Deloitte Football Finance Report and highlight the fact that because the Premier League has the highest revenues of any league in Europe, the Premier League clubs can afford to pay the highest wage bill, which means on average the Premier League clubs have the highest quality football squads. Therefore, the average quality of the athletic contest in a Premier League club is on average higher than the other national team competitions in Europe, such as Germany, Italy and France. Spain has, La Liga has a competitive advantage in that it has two super clubs, Barcelona and Real Madrid, who, due to the historic practice in Spain of individual selling where these clubs control their own broadcasting rights, they are able to generate super revenues and attract superstar players, which allows them to generate a high level of revenue, which allows them to be particularly successful in European club competitions. However, it is the case that La Liga has a significantly smaller international broadcasting revenue than the Premier League. My proposition to you is that one of the possible explanations for that, in fact the probable explanation, is that because the wage bills of the typical English Premier League club are higher, the average quality of the playing squad is higher, therefore the average match broadcast is more attractive to viewers. Another key selling point for the English competitions are that while the Premier League is played in England, 2/3 of the players typically are not English. So if one was being provocative, one might say the Premier League is an international competition that happens to be played in England. Many of the most successful Korean players, Key for example, formerly of Celtic and Swansea, play in the English Premier League. This obviously enhances the attractiveness of Premier League broadcasting rights internationally, because the rights can be sold in particular countries on the basis that you can see the best international talent, and you may even see the best players from your own country. The Premier League does not have a winter break. Germany has a winter break in order to enhance the competitiveness of the national team. But this leaves a 5 to 6 week gap during the winter when the Bundesliga is not broadcast, which is obviously a problem if you're trying to sell the broadcasting rights internationally, because it leaves a gap in the broadcaster schedule. Perhaps that's an illustration of a particular problem which has been a significant criticism in England of the Premier League, which says that because the number of English players playing in Premier League clubs has dramatically declined, that this reduces the pool of players available for the English national team. And it's also the case that because the level of competition in the Premier League is so high, because of the high level of competitive balance, that the competition is very, very intensive, which means that the English clubs may potentially be less competitive in UEFA Cup competitions. And it is the case that the Premier League clubs are the third most successful after the Germans and the Spanish in UEFA club competitions. So there are potential negative side effects of the Premier League organisation for the English national team, and possibly for the performance of English clubs in UEFA competitions. But this does not seem to have affected the popularity of the Premier League, both in terms of attendances, which are twice what they were in 1982, despite the fact that ticket prices have increased dramatically, and the extraordinary popularity globally of the Premier League as a TV product. Finally, going back to one of the observations I made right at the very beginning when discussing Walter Neal's theoretical perspective on sports competitions, is that historically there has been a tendency for sports club owners to overspend to achieve supporting success at the expense of profitability. And this was certainly the pattern in Europe, where they did not adopt the North American remedy for this of closed leagues with no promotion or relegation. As I've already alluded to, this was not a problem in Europe, while revenues were quite small, because whatever losses clubs made were not that great. However, paradoxically, the arrival of the Premier League and the arrival of pay-per-view broadcasting meant that a paradox emerged whereby as revenues increased, so did losses, as lower revenue teams overspent to try to compete with the higher revenue teams. UEFA first addressed this problem by introducing what it called financial fair play system in 2011-2012. This was a licensing criteria for entry into the competitions. In shorthand, what it meant was that you could not compete in UEFA competitions if you spent more than you earned on labour. The Premier League introduced a less aggressive form of the system in 13-14. The impact of this has been that essentially a soft salary cap has been introduced into the Premier League, which means that clubs are now unable to overspend to the extent that it can challenge their financial stability. And from 13-14, the majority of Premier League clubs are now profitable at the pre-tax level. To conclude, you could argue that the Premier League has now achieved a virtuous circle of competitive advantage. There is a high level of competitive balance in the league. Historically, what they really wanted to achieve was a high level of match day uncertainty. But the extraordinary success of Leicester City in the 15-16 season illustrates that within the Premier League model, with the aggressive redistribution of TV income, it's possible for even a club from a small city to actually win the competition. This dramatically enhances the attractiveness of the competition to TV viewers and increases the value of the broadcasting rights. Secondly, because the Premier League has been so successful in driving revenues across match day, broadcasting and commercial, the clubs are able to afford to pay the highest playing budgets of any league in Europe, which means that on average the quality of the athletic contest in the Premier League is higher than in the other leagues. Again, this is a highly valuable element in the basket of critical success factors for the league. Thirdly, the playing squads are highly international. As I've said earlier, 2/3 of the players are typically not from England. Again, if you are seeking to sell the Premier League in an international broadcasting market, this is a major source of competitive advantage, because international markets, international consumers of sport want to see the best of the international talent playing in the competition. 4, typically the British stadia, the English stadia, are of very high quality, have all been modernised in the last 20 to 25 years. They also tend to be full. And of course they're drawing on the long cultural history of English football over 150 years, with the extraordinary emotional support, the fan equity element that English fans tend to have for their teams. The fact that the Premier League facilitates the attendance of significant numbers of away fans at the games enhances the atmosphere in the ground, and again makes it the product particularly attractive for broadcasters. If one is to contrast this with Serie A, which in the 90s was the commercially most dynamic league in Europe, you can see the difference. Serie A is suffered from a severe problem with hooliganism, which has led to the banning of away fans in many games. The stadia are typically owned by local authorities rather than clubs and are of poor standard, which means that frequently they're only half full, which makes the competition less attractive, particularly internationally. Extraneous factors also play a role. In the UK at the moment there is a very, very intense battle for broadband customers. There are 5 or 6 major players in the market, but critically, Sky is competing for broadcast customers with the BT Telecoms company. BT has established its own sports broadcasting channel and is now an aggressive purchaser of broadcasting rights for Premier League football. So the Premier League has been a beneficiary of competition in an adjacent marketplace. The Premier League clubs themselves, when the league was established, were not commercially sophisticated. 25 years later, that is no longer the case. One is only to look at the very, very sophisticated manner in which almost every Premier League club utilises social media, such as Twitter, to see that a major revolution in commercial practice is underway in the Premier League and among its clubs. This is manifested in growing independent commercial revenue streams by the individual clubs themselves. One cannot underestimate the impact of the introduction of financial fair play systems. There's a saying in business in Britain, revenue is vanity, profit is sanity. So you can generate whatever revenue you like, but if your costs exceed your revenues, you're going to be in problem at some point. What the introduction of financial fair play has done, it has protected lower revenue clubs from the temptation to overspend to achieve short-term sporting success. It has created an incentive for clubs to generate more revenue, to be more commercially dynamic, because it is only by increasing revenue that they can spend more than wages, because at the heart of the financial fair play proposition is that you cannot spend more than you earn on labour. This has been a critical factor. If I was to summarise the case as follows, I think what it does is it illustrates the extraordinary complexity of sport business and sport competitions, where they intersect with the commercial world. A lot of what has happened in the Premier League has happened by accident. But I think that the critical, if you wanted to define one defining characteristic of the Premier League, it's its adaptability. They have critically adapted at key points, for example, the adoption of financial fair play, for example, the commitment to retain an aggressive redistribution of revenues, because they recognised that these were potential sources of competitive advantage. They adapted when they recognised that there was while there might have been a short-term advantage to increase ticket prices for away fans, in the long term it was better to cap prices in order to ensure that significant numbers of away fans attended the grounds, in order to enhance the atmosphere, which has a knock-on effect on broadcasting revenues. In short, organising a professional sports league is not just a matter of sitting down with a grand plan and making out the blueprint. Obviously that's a key element, but it's also about an ability to strategically adapt to changes in the marketplace. At Birkbeck, what we try to do is to provide you with the core theoretical perspectives on how sport competition is organised and delivered, to allow you to use them to interrogate case studies, to identify why certain competitions, why certain athletes are successful and why others are not. The curriculum at Birkbeck is very, very heavily case study driven, real world case study driven. A lot of what you will learn will be in the lectures, will be what you read in the library. But critically, a lot of what you will learn will be from debating with your fellow students from Europe, from the UK, from North America, from Korea, discussing, arguing in an informed way what is driving success or indeed failure in any particular sporting environment. I hope you enjoy the rest of the British Council Sport Week. My Birkbeck colleagues are here to take your questions. I'm also available to take any questions via email at a later date. Feel free to get in contact as you feel appropriate. I hope you enjoy the rest of the evening, and I hope to see some of you at Birkbeck in the new academic year.